Wowman Kwupp by Nanny Linda. Roland Krupp parked his car outside the house with a for sale sign that now read sold. It was number 17 Sunnyside Meadows, one of 20 homes in that particular road. He walked along the pavement, pushing open the creaky gate, and stood in the well-maintained garden, and the time was 8:15. Just then, a lady cycled by, gasping, red-faced, puffing and panting aloud, and she shouted, "Hello, new neighbour. I live at number 8. I'm Eleanor Stroud." "Hi there. I'm very pleased to meet you. My name is Roland Krupp." "Sorry I can't stop to chat now," shouted Eleanor, "but if you need anything, just look me up." When Eleanor reached her home, tired and exhausted, she poured herself a glass of ice-cold water. "I've just met our new neighbour," she said between glugs and gasping for air to Emily, her teenage daughter. A Roland Krupp seemed a pleasant young man, smartly dressed with very blonde hair. Unusual name though. Perhaps he's German. I didn't want to stop and stare. The next day Roland greeted the removal men, who started to unpack and unload, just as Becky Simpson and her little boy Joey were outside his house and trying to cross the road. Roland shouted, "Good morning. I'm your new neighbour, Roland Krupp." But because Joey was having a tantrum, Becky couldn't hear him well enough. She waved and introduced herself and said she would stop and chat at a later date, as she was in a hurry for Joey's playgroup and she didn't want to be late. Later that day, when Becky's partner came home, she told him she had met their new neighbour at number 17, but she didn't have time for a very long chat as Joey had started to scream. It sounded like his name was Nolan Cut. Quite unusual, don't you think? Then started to prepare the evening meal, skinning potatoes in the kitchen sink. Roland was thrilled with his lovely new home. The garden and decking were an added bonus too. All thanks to an inheritance from a lovely lady, his grandma, Monica Sue. "Howdy, neighbour," came a voice later that day from over the garden fence. "I'm Roger, and this is my wife Gail, and our little Dalmatian pup Spence. I hope his barking doesn't bother you too much. His overexcitement will hopefully fade." And he laughed and said, "I really don't take much notice, probably because I don't wear my hearing aid." "That's okay," replied Roland. "I'm Roland Krupp, by the way." And Roger nodded his head and smiled and dragged a barking Spence away. Roger went into his house and said to his wife Gail, "The new neighbour seems a pleasant lad. I think he said he was called Roland Krupp. Unusual name, but then my hearing is very bad." Roland was slowly getting to know his neighbours up and down Sunnyside Meadows and on every side, especially his neighbour little Tommy McKee, whose football was always flying by. "Thank you, Wowman," little Tommy would say, each time Roland returned his ball, with a header that made little Tommy giggle with delight as it came flying over the wall. For little Tommy, Roland's name was Wowman Kwupp, and that was what he told his mum Jeanette. So for most of the new neighbours that Roland had greeted, not one of them had gotten his name right yet. Connie and Germaine across the road waved and said hi when they went out for a walk, and only heard Roland shout out his name. They didn't actually stop and talk. "That's a very strange name, Bowman Chup," said Connie. "Sounds kind of foreign, don't you think?" "It does indeed," replied her husband Germaine. "We'll invite him around for some nibbles and a drink." Lydia Mallory Jenkins was strolling along very slowly with a walking stick in each hand, as she was recovering from a nasty fall when she was helping herd in her daughter Kay's new cows on some very muddy farmland. She saw Roland as he was coming home from work and walking down his garden path, ready for a glass of cold white wine and a soak in his new whirlpool bath. Lydia introduced herself and was explaining her immobility situation. Then as Roland started talking, a helicopter flew overhead with a very noisy chopper blade rotation. Roland waved and ran inside to prepare for his relaxing evening, as Lydia Mallory Jenkins just stood pondering on their very brief first meeting. Did she just hear clearly? It was so difficult with the overhead chopper noise. Did he say his name was Boldman Ketchup? Perhaps it wasn't his birth name, just his name of choice. As time went by and the neighbours chatted here and there, they soon came to realise that their new neighbour at number 17 had several different names due to the lack of attention, deafness and overhead noise. So they had a neighbourhood meeting and decided to hold a barbecue, a friendly meet and greet, to really get to know their new neighbour, to discover his real name, wanting to be respectful and very discreet. So the afternoon of the barbecue, Roland really enjoyed himself with the lovely food and drink and the very friendly chat. But nobody actually called him by his name, and Roland was very confused about that fact. People were in groups chatting about Roland's correct name situation, and little Tommy listened in to all the different name variations. The neighbours, so engrossed in their chat, suddenly stopped when ear-splitting laughter filled the air, and they turned and saw Roland and little Tommy with happy tears. What a laughing pair! Little Tommy had spoken with Roland and explained what was going on as best as he possibly could, with all the names, or what sounded like names, that had travelled around the neighbourhood. When Roland eventually ceased his laughing, he then had another bout, and then, as that wave of laughter ceased, another laugh noisily screeched out. "My name is Roland Krupp," he finally managed to say. "But out of every variation that is circulating, my favourite is Wowman Kwupp today." Everybody had a jolly good laugh that day, and over the next days, weeks, months and years. And every time Roland remembered the array of names, he laughed so hard he always cried happy tears. Roland had a housewarming party towards the end of summer that very first year, and he unveiled the nameplate for number 17 Sunnyside Meadows, Wowman Kwupp, one of the names that always gives him happy tears.